Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome everyone in today's class for the third intermediate grade. Our textbook is Super Goal 6 and today we will cover unit Culture Shock. The lessons are about you and conversation. This lesson will be presented by me, teacher Mazra Harbi. So let's begin. Our objectives in today's lesson, we hope that at the end of this lesson you will be able to discuss common situations and also practice a conversation and answer questions about the conversation. Before we do this, let's make quick revision on our last lesson. Last lesson we had four different three different lessons where we talked about in language and context. We have an exercise that tell us try to discuss with a partner, maybe a family member or a friend of ours, about how people handle the following situations in your country. For example, how people handling people who stand in line, or people who eat late at night, or people who taking a rest in the afternoon, or shaking hands, or taking your shoes off in the house, or arrives late. So how people usually in your country deal with these sort of situations. What do they do? Do they instruct them? Do they have are there for example something that is allowed or not allowed similar to these situations? So what do you usually do in these kind of situations? And we have discussed this as we did also in the listening, where we listened to an advice about traveling to the United States, and we answered questions, the true or false questions about this listening text, and also with pronunciation, where we notice how the letter to is reduced and pronounced quickly, the preposition to, where we said, for example, how can we pronounce it when we say it's polite to shake hands, or advisable to study the customs, or it's impolite to stare at people. So we have learned as well how can we either reduce the pronunciation of the preposition to or not. So in today's lesson, let's begin first with a couple of important questions about you questions. So here I have a question I would like to ask you, and I would like you to answer them and at least to think about these questions. Let's begin with our first question. Our first question here is, what the do's and don'ts do you know about for different countries? And what are some cultural differences that you may know about? So let's begin with the first one. So what are the do's and don'ts that you know about for different countries? It means, what do you mean by the do's or don'ts? The things that you either allowed to do or the things that you're not allowed. So when we speak about different countries, when we talk about different places, can you remember or can you recall or can you say what are the things that allowed in that country and it's not allowed in different country? So just try to think about this question and tell us what you think. Do you think that there are something that is allowed in a country and it's not allowed in another country? And when you do so, what are some of the cultural differences you may know about? What are the differences in regards of culture, in regards of customs and traditions and language and habits and all of these? So what about the cultural differences that you may know about and that they are available in these countries? So are there cultural differences? Of course, we know that from different parts of the world, they have their own customs and their own traditions and practices. So what about you? What do you know about this information? So just try to think about it and try to have it in mind while we are about to listen and practice our lesson for today. Number two, are there different customs in different parts of your country? And what are the differences? So if we agree that there are, of course, different customs and tradition when we're moving from one country to another, we agree on this. But what about one single country? Do they have in one country different customs and different traditions? Let's talk about, for example, your country. So do they have, or does it have, for example, different customs? Maybe in the north area or north region, and the southern region, or the western or eastern region. Do they have different customs, different traditions, maybe different accents when they speak? If the answer is yes, so what are they? Maybe some people would say that they have different customs in regard of hosting new people or hosting new visitors. Maybe they have different customs when they invite people to a large meal. Maybe they have different customs in the clothes they are wearing. So there are, of course, we're going to find out that there are different customs and different cultural, semi-cultural differences in each of these regions. Question number 3. Have you ever lived or traveled abroad? And did you have any difficulty of adjusting or in adjusting? So just remember or try to recall the last time you went abroad, or from the people around you who went abroad. So do you think that they face a difficulty in trying to adjusting and trying to blend in with the new society or with the new place or even with the local people? Do you think that they face a difficulty? And if you do so, what do you think the kind of difficulty that they faced? Is it difficulty in terms of a language, or in terms of the way they dressed, or in terms of maybe the driving rules? So do they, you may ask around, do they face difficulty when they move to a new place? This is a very interesting question to think of. And also the fourth one, have you ever had a problem because of cultural difference? And explain. As I said earlier, maybe some people who went abroad that they have a difficulty in regards of cultural differences, in regards of the way they wear or their clothes, and maybe the language, and maybe the behaviors, and maybe the some of the practices that maybe it is allowed in a country but it's not allowed in other countries. So again, what about you? Or you may ask a friend or people around you about this question. What kind of the difficulty that they face, and not any difficulty, but difficulty in cultural differences when they move to a new place. And the fifth question that I would like you to consider, which is, what are the common gestures in your culture? And what do they mean? What are the common gestures, the common moves, the common behaviors that usually available or are there in your country? And what each of them mean? So for example, of course, different countries in the way they serve food, in the way they greet people, in the way that they wear clothes. Of course, they have different gestures, different moves, different practices that each one of them, of course, for the local people, each one of them has a meaning. Maybe the local people know it, but not the newcomers or the new visitors. So would you try to recall some of these gestures that are available in your country and some of these moves, just to help you know more about the cultural differences? And you can even, to make it more interesting, you can even compare it with other gestures and other practices that were there in different country. So this is about you question. These are very important questions that I would like you to consider before we move on to our conversation. Now, I would like you please to open your books on page 63. I would like you please to open your books on page 63. Before we begin our conversation here, without looking at the book, I would like you to have a look at this picture and tell me, answer this question. What is the city in the picture? What do you think the city in the picture? As you can see, there is a sea and there are skyscrapers. So what do you think the place is? Very good. The place is, it's Shanghai in China. So what do we need to do now is that we're going to listen to a conversation about that takes place in this city. So as we usually do, we're going to listen to this conversation twice. The first time you only listen for listening, and for the second time you listen while you try to understand some of the meaning and some of the expressions that mentioned here. So now we're going to move to the conversation, this conversation between Will and Edgar. So let's listen to the conversation. After we listen to this conversation twice. We will have a couple of questions to answer. So let's begin. Now, we have listening to the conversation for the first time. Now we're going to listen to this conversation for the second time, and this time you try to listen carefully and just to grasp some of the ideas and words that were mentioned here. So let's begin. Very well. Now we have listened to this conversation twice. So as we have understand from this conversation, here we have two friends, one of them whose name is Edgar, who visited China, and the other friend, Will, is trying to ask him questions just about the cultural differences about China. And Edgar has talked about different things or different customs that he faced there in China. One of them is that he said that the family name is usually comes before the first name, and how he handled or come to an incident where when he called one name or a name for his colleague, three colleagues of him answered him. So Will went back again and asked him that question, which is, what did you do in that situation? What did you do? So this conversation will be between Will and Edgar. We're going to listen to this conversation as we always do. We're going to listen to it twice. The first time we only listen for listening, and the second time we'll listen to try to grasp new ideas and also some of the new words. So let's begin.
So, what's it like living and working in China?
Well, to be honest, in today's globalized world there isn't really all that much difference anymore, especially in big cities like Shanghai where I'm based. There's a lot of traffic, crowded subways and buses, tall skyscrapers and modern shopping malls just like in other large cities around the world.
Have any differences struck you?
Well, the food is very different, and eating with chopsticks was tricky at first, especially rice and noodles. But I got the hang of it.
What about the language?
Most of the people I work with speak English well. I'm still learning Chinese to handle everyday situations.
Is there anything else you're not used to yet?
No, I've adjusted to the way of life. However, there's still one thing that's kind of weird to me. In China, the family name comes before the first name, and millions of people have the same surname. For example, Wang, Li, Zhang, Chen, and so on are the most common.
No kidding.
Yeah, at work when I called out Joe, 3 colleagues used to answer me. But I managed to solve the problem.
What did you do?
So now we finished listening for the first time. Now we're going to listen for the second time, and as I said, try to grasp on new ideas and listen carefully for new words.
So, what's it like living and working in China?
Well, to be honest, in today's globalized world there isn't really all that much difference anymore, especially in big cities like Shanghai where I'm based. There's a lot of traffic, crowded subways and buses, tall skyscrapers and modern shopping malls just like in other large cities around the world.
Have any differences struck you?
Well, the food is very different, and eating with chopsticks was tricky at first, especially rice and noodles. But I got the hang of it.
What about the language?
Most of the people I work with speak English well. I'm still learning Chinese to handle everyday situations.
Is there anything else you're not used to yet?
No, I've adjusted to the way of life. However, there's still one thing that's kind of weird to me. In China, the family name comes before the first name, and millions of people have the same surname. For example, Wang, Li, Zhang, Chen, and so on are the most common.
No kidding.
Yeah, at work when I called out Joe, 3 colleagues used to answer me. But I managed to solve the problem.
What did you do?
So, now, we have listened to this conversation twice. And as we have listened to Will and Edgar, who Edgar was the person who went to China, and Will trying to ask him about the cultural differences and the things that he came across when he went to China in terms of language and food, and also any weird incident that he may came across of. Like, for example, when Edgar said in this case that millions of people in China have the same surname. And when he tried to call his friend, 3 of his colleagues answered him because they have the same surname. So this conversation ended by when Will is asking, what did you do? So right now we still need to finish this conversation. Before we do this, let's have a look at the meaning of some of the highlighted words in blue that were mentioned here in this conversation. The first one was to be honest. And what do you mean by this word? We usually use it to state something more directly. And the second term, which is to get the hang of something, it means to get used to it and to get used to doing something the right way. And kind of, it means rather. And no kidding, usually this is an expression when someone is expressing his surprise and disbelief. So these were the terms that we have come across. And also, let's now try to finish the conversation. So if you were in Edgar's place, what would you answer? When I will ask, what did you do? Would you say that, number 1, I found out the first name of each one? Or number 2, together we came up with a Western name for each, like for example, John, George, and Joe. Or number 3, I left my workstation and went and talked to each one. So if you were in Edgar's place, what would you choose? Is it a 1 or 2 or 3? Now, let's try to answer a couple of questions about this conversation. Let's begin with the first one. The first question said, what things does Edgar say are the same in Shanghai? What things does Edgar say that are the same in Shanghai, and it's not or it doesn't differ from other country? So he said that there's a lot of traffic, as we can see in every country, also crowded buses and tall buildings, and also modern shopping malls. And these things we nearly we can see them in different countries and in different cities. Question number 2. What's his conversational Chinese like? What's his conversational Chinese like? His languages skills, especially in Chinese. So what was he like, especially when he talked about it? Very good. Yes, Edgar said that I'm still learning Chinese for everyday situations, for real life situations, from his commuting and also his shopping and his daily experience. Now, let's move on to the third question. The third question said, what did Edgar find difficult at first, at the beginning when he went to China? What was the first thing that he found it difficult at the beginning? Very good. Yes, he said that eating with chopsticks was difficult for him at first. Eating with chopsticks, because he's not used to it, of course. The fourth question we have is, what is unusual about Chinese surnames or family names? What is unusual? What is the things that differs from what Edgar's is used to? Very good. Yes, he said that the surnames come before the first names. This is number 1. So a lot of or million of people have the same surname. So this is the difficulty or the trouble that Edgar found himself in when he called his friend. Now, before we finish the last part of our lesson today, your turn. What I would like you to do is try to role play the conversation like the one above, but use the different country. Express surprise at some of the things mentioned. So for example, you may call a friend of yours, maybe a family member or maybe a classmate, and try to role play this conversation. For example, you can be in place of will, where you can get to ask a question about the place that your friend or your partner went to. And you can change China, maybe you can read about or different information about the country, and then you can make a whole conversation about the country, the same as we have read here. It will be more interesting even so if you find someone who went to actually to a place that you haven't been before, and you can ask him the same questions as mentioned here in this conversation. Now, don't forget to check on your workbook on page 127 for additional reading practices. And now we have reached the end of our lesson. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.